There was no word for it. For decades, the people who fight wildfires in California had a vocabulary for the things they faced. A big fire, a megafire, the term they reached for when a blaze crossed 100,000 acres and seemed almost unstoppable. But in the autumn of 2020, a fire grew so far past every limit of that language that the old words simply stopped working. It burned through 100,000 acres, then 200,000, then 500,000, and it kept going. And when it finally crossed a line that no fire in the modern history of the state had ever crossed, people had to dig up a word that had almost never been needed. They called it a gigafire, a fire that burns more than 1 million acres of land. This is the story of how California's forests produced the first one anyone had seen in generations, and of the strange and violent night that lit the match. To understand how a single fire grows to the size of a small state, you have to start with the ground it burned.
What's happening in California right now is certainly unprecedented in modern history.
By the summer of 2020, Northern California was a tinderbox that had been drying out for years. The state was sliding into another drought. A La Niña pattern was steering the usual rains away, and the wet season that should have soaked the hills was running late. Across the mountains and forests of the northern Coast Range, the grass was brittle, the brush was dry, and the trees were full of dead and water-starved wood after years of stress. There were, by some estimates, more than a century's worth of fuel sitting on that landscape, the product of decades of aggressive fire suppression that had stopped the small natural burns that once kept the forests thinned. All of it was waiting. All it needed was a spark. What it got on the night of August 16th and into the 17th was tens of thousands of them. A rare and violent weather event rolled across Northern California that night, the remnants of a tropical system pushing a wall of thunderstorms over the bone-dry hills. But these storms carried almost no rain. They were dry lightning storms, the most dangerous kind there is, hurling bolt after bolt into the parched landscape without dropping enough water to do anything but feed the flames they started. Dry lightning is a peculiar terror of the Western fire world. In most of the country, a thunderstorm means a downpour, and a downpour drowns a fledgling fire before it can grow. In California's late summer, the air near the ground can be so hot and dry that the rain evaporates on the way down, never reaching the dirt, while the lightning still arrives at full force. The result is thousands of ignitions and nothing to put them out. Over roughly 72 hours, more than 12,000 lightning strikes hit the state. They started fires everywhere, hundreds of them, igniting all at once across an enormous area in terrain so remote and rugged that crews often couldn't reach them. In the Coast Range north of the Bay Area, lightning lit dozens of separate blazes in a single county in a matter of hours. This was the nightmare that fire commanders had always dreaded. Not one big fire, which they knew how to attack, but hundreds of fires breaking out simultaneously, scattered across mountains and canyons, each one growing while every available crew and engine and aircraft in the state was already committed somewhere else. There was no way to be everywhere at once. Air tankers that might have knocked down a new fire in its first hour were grounded by smoke or already flying for another blaze. Hand crews that might have cut a line around a few acres were a day's hike from the flames. With nobody able to stop them in those first critical hours, many of the small fires did what small fires do in dry, windy mountains. They grew. And then they began to find each other. In the Mendocino National Forest, a cluster of these lightning fires was burning close together. Fire managers, recognizing they were dealing with one connected problem rather than many separate ones, grouped them under a single name and called the whole thing the August Complex. At the start, the individual fires inside it were modest, a few hundred acres here, 1,000 there. But the conditions that had birthed them, the heat, the drought, the wind, the endless supply of dry fuel, were the same conditions that let them spread. Over the following days, the largest of the fires inside the complex swelled and pushed across the rough country, and one by one they started to merge. The Doe Fire, the biggest of them, swallowed its smaller neighbors. Then it reached out and joined with other fires that had started as entirely separate incidents. What had been a scattering of lightning strikes was fusing into a single, growing monster. And all of this was happening inside the worst fire season the state had ever recorded. Because the August lightning siege did not just create the August Complex. It set off a chain of disasters across all of California at the same time. That year, blazes erupted up and down the state, choking the air with smoke for weeks, turning the sky over San Francisco a deep, apocalyptic orange in the middle of the day. The sun blotted out so completely that streetlights came on at noon, and people woke up convinced something had gone terribly wrong with the world. Photographs from that morning looked less like a city and more like the surface of another planet. Elsewhere in the state, the fires were trapping people outright. In the Sierra Nevada, one blaze exploded so fast that hundreds of campers and hikers were cut off at a reservoir, with the only road out in flames, and military helicopters had to fly in through the smoke at night to lift them out in waves. Tens of thousands of firefighters were spread across dozens of major incidents, exhausted, stretched impossibly thin, jumping from one front to the next. Working shifts that ran far past the point of safety because there was simply no one to relieve them. 5 of the 6 largest fires in the entire recorded history of California would happen in that single year. And the largest of them all, the one that would outgrow every fire the state had ever seen, was the August Complex, still burning in the mountains of the north, still growing. On September 9th, it crossed a grim milestone. The August Complex surpassed the previous record holder, the Mendocino Complex of 2018, to become the single largest wildfire in the recorded history of California. That earlier fire had been considered almost unthinkable in its scale just 2 years before. Now, it had been beaten, and the fire that beat it was nowhere near done. It kept eating its way across Glenn County, Tehama County, Trinity County, Lake County, spreading into one rural community's evacuation zone after another, forcing people to flee, closing entire national forests, and growing on a scale that the firefighting efforts simply could not contain. The crews could lay down hundreds of miles of containment lines, and the fire would still jump them and run. There is a hard truth about a fire this large that the public rarely hears. At a certain size, in certain conditions, firefighters are no longer really trying to put the fire out. That is not possible. A blaze burning across hundreds of thousands of acres of steep, roadless wilderness, throwing embers a mile ahead of itself, generating its own wind, cannot be extinguished by people with hoses and shovels and bulldozers. What the crews can do is try to steer it, to defend the towns in its path, to cut lines along the few places where the terrain gives them a chance, and to wait for the weather to change. For weeks, that is what they did. They protected ranches and rural settlements. They backed off when the fire's behavior turned too dangerous, and they watched a wall of flame move across the mountains on its own schedule, knowing that in the end, it would stop only when it ran out of fuel or the rains finally came. On a fire that becomes a gigafire, the weather always has the last word, not the firefighters. Then, in early October, the August Complex did the thing that gave it a place in history. On a Monday in the first week of the month, the fire crossed 1 million acres. To put a number that large into any kind of human scale is almost impossible, so consider it this way. 1 million acres is more than 1,500 square miles. It is an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. It is roughly 1% of all the land in California, the third largest state in the country, consumed by a single connected fire. A blaze that size is not really a fire in the way most people picture one. It is a moving weather system of its own, generating its own wind, its own towering columns of smoke that punch into the upper atmosphere, its own pulse across the landscape. And with that, the word that had sat unused for so long finally had to come out. The August complex had become the first gigafire in California's modern history. The term itself was rare for a reason. A fire that breaks the million-acre mark is not something the modern, well-mapped, aggressively managed era of American firefighting had produced before in this state. To find fires of that scale, you have to reach back across the country and across the decades to a complex in Alaska in 2004, or to the vast historic burns of more than a century ago, before modern fire suppression existed at all. California crossing that line was not just another bad fire season. It was a sign that something about the relationship between the state and fire had fundamentally shifted, that the conditions now existed for a single blaze to grow without any real ceiling. For all its staggering size, the August complex was, in one mercy, not the deadliest fire of that era. It burned largely through remote and mountainous national forest, not through dense towns the way some of California's most lethal fires have. But it was not without a terrible human cost. A firefighter lost their life battling it. Communities across 7 counties were forced from their homes, some more than once, never knowing if there would be anything to come back to. Thousands of people lived for weeks under skies the color of rust, breathing some of the worst air on the planet, watching the ridgelines glow orange at night. The smoke from the fire and its many siblings drifted across the country and even across the ocean, a haze that the whole state and much of the continent lived under that autumn. The people who lived in the fire's path spent that autumn in a state of suspended dread. These are small, scattered communities in the mountains and valleys of the north, ranching country and timber country. Places where families have worked the same land for generations and where help is always a long way off. When the evacuation orders came, people loaded what they could into trucks and trailers, moved their livestock if there was time, and drove out past ridgelines glowing orange in the dark, not knowing whether the home behind them would still be standing in a week. Some came back to find their houses spared, the fire having swept past on a shift of the wind. Others came back to ash. Ranchers lost grazing land and fences and barns that would take years, and money many of them did not have to rebuild. And the smoke settled into the valleys and stayed, so that even the towns the flames never reached lived for weeks in a brown haze that made it dangerous to go outside, the air thick enough to taste, the sun a dim red disk at midday. For these communities, the Gigafire was not a statistic or a record. It was the autumn the mountains burned and would not stop. The fire was not fully contained until November 12th. By the time it was finally declared out, it had burned a total of 1,032,648 acres. It had crossed 7 counties. It had rewritten the record books and forced a new word into common use. And it had done so as the centerpiece of a year in which more than 4 million acres of California burned, more than double the previous record for a single season. The hard question that the August complex left behind is why? Why now? Why this size? Why a word that had almost never been needed? The answers are tangled together, and experts argue about how much weight to give each one. Part of it is more than a century of fire suppression. The well-intentioned policy of putting out every fire as fast as possible, which over generations allowed dead wood and brush to pile up into an enormous reservoir of fuel that nature would once have burned off in smaller doses. For thousands of years before that policy existed, the indigenous peoples of California had deliberately set low, controlled fires across these landscapes, and they let natural fires run, keeping the forests open and thinned and far less prone to the kind of catastrophic blaze that levels everything in its path. When that practice was stamped out and replaced with total suppression, the fuel that those small fires used to clear simply accumulated, year after year, decade after decade, until the forests held far more of it than they ever had under natural conditions. Part of it is the steady warming of the climate, which makes the hot seasons hotter, the dry seasons drier, and the vegetation more flammable, lengthening the window each year when a spark can explode into a catastrophe. And part of it is simple bad luck. The rare, dry lightning storm that happened to strike a landscape primed to burn. Pull any one of those threads and the fire might have been smaller. Together they made a gigafire. The damage a fire like this does to the land does not end when the flames go out. A burn of this size strips the vegetation off entire watersheds, and the bare, scorched soil left behind can turn hard and water-repellent, so that the first heavy rains of winter no longer soak in. Instead, the water sheets off the dead slopes all at once, picking up ash and mud and burned timber, and comes down the canyons as debris flows, walls of black slurry that can bury roads and homes far below the burn scar months after the fire is over. The forests themselves take decades to come back, and some of them, pushed past a certain point by repeated fire and a changing climate, may not return as forest at all, converting instead into brush and grassland. A gigafire does not just consume a year, it reshapes the land for a generation. What unsettles the people who study these things is that none of those underlying conditions has gone away. The fuel is still there, the climate is still warming, and the dry lightning storms, the heat waves, the wind events that drive these fires are not getting rarer. The August complex was called the first gigafire in California's modern history. The word that mattered most in that sentence, the one that should give anyone pause, was not gigafire. It was first. So here is what I want to ask you. Before that autumn, most people had never heard the word gigafire in their lives because there had never been a reason to use it. Now it exists, and the conditions that created it are still in place. Do you think a single fire burning more than 1 million acres will stay a once-in-a-generation event, the rare convergence of drought and lightning and bad luck? Or do you think we have crossed into an era where a fire that size becomes something we simply learn to expect? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want to understand how the land itself is changing under these disasters, stay with me, because this is only one chapter in a much larger story about a country learning to live with weather it was never built for.